Okay, welcome everyone. Yeah, happy to have you for the latest live stream for this Solana Ignition Hackathon. And today I'm joined by Joe McCann from Microsoft and Crypto Twitter. Welcome, Joe. How's it going, man?
Great, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So you're kind of a prolific Solana community member, always engaging with projects, and I think a lot of the folks in the community know who you are. But for those maybe who don't, could you just give a background on yourself and kind of how you got into crypto?
Yeah, well, where do we start? So I have been a technologist and a trader, both self-taught for about 21 years now. So definitely dating myself. But I've also been super active in open source and really just fascinating with the future of the internet and the web, basically my entire career as well. And over the past decade or so, I've kind of flexed between being a CTO at a creative ad agency in New York City to the CEO and co-founder of NodeSource, which is the NodeJS company. And NodeJS is probably the most successful and largest open source project of the last decade. Certainly every Web3 application today uses it. And then after I moved out of that role as CEO and chairman, I was figuring out what I wanted to do next. And I joined a hedge fund to run a quant trading desk for cryptocurrencies. And this was in 2018, 2019. Tough time to be in crypto. So transitioned out of that. Really enjoyed my experience, but it was really like the industry itself was just not really there yet. And so I said, you know what, I want to keep doing like my own thing with crypto. And decided to join Microsoft in the Cloud and Artificial Intelligence division organization in developer division, which is where VS Code, Visual Studio, GitHub Code Spaces, TypeScript, a bunch of different tools and services the developers use every day. That's the team that I get to work with. And how I got into crypto was, I think as a technologist, I read the Bitcoin white paper a long time ago, but as a trader, I didn't really see a market in 2011 or 2012. So I kind of waited and started to see things really firm up with Ethereum and a bunch of other alternative coins, probably over the past 6 or 7 years. And got super active into it when I started to transition out of my role as CEO from my own company. It's really hard to be super active in crypto and also run a company. So I did that. So I've been like, I guess, super active over the past, call it 4 years. But I've been kind of dabbling in the space for 6 and exposed to it for almost 10.
Awesome. And how did you learn about Solana for the first time? How did you come about it?
Yeah, it's interesting. The hedge fund I worked at, I think there's a guy who I worked with who's I think he's at Galaxy now. He actually was the first person to mention Solana, and this was, I think it was maybe when Anatoly was raising the seed round. It was a while ago, maybe 2018 or 2019, whatever that was. And what stood out to me as different about it was proof of history. And I thought to myself, like, I was a skeptic, like most people are in crypto or just in technology in general. But I did think, if this thing works, it could be pretty big. It could be like a game changer in terms of the types of applications that can be built on, a decentralized compute platform or network like Solana. So, I was exposed to it, I guess, early on when they were raising money early on, kind of like didn't really pay too much attention to it till mainnet last year. And then got really, really bullish on it when I started to see the types of applications that you could be building on it. Things like Serum, for example, stood out. And then all the kind of the additional applications that we've seen over the course of the past year. So in my Telegram chat, I think I was mentioning Solana as early as like January 2nd of this year, basically saying like, I think this has the shot at being a true, top 5 L1 chain. So on the kind of investment side, there's a big opportunity there. But I think more importantly is that what's driving a lot of that growth is the opportunity for developers to actually build on a platform that enables Web 2.0 style experiences on a Web3 chain. And that's really like, there's the investment side of it where you're long Solana, but then there's also like being long just this shift that's happening from Web 2 to Web 3. and Solana kind of being at the center point of that.
Got it. And I mean, you said you were pretty involved in like Node.js in its early days and that kind of like community. Do you see like similarities between kind of what happened there in the past and what you're seeing with crypto and Solana today?
100%. Yeah. So I think one of the main reasons I get so excited about Solana specifically is it's almost the exact same type of fervent activity by developers into the Solana ecosystem. And the last time I saw that was with Node.js. And just to be clear, in 2009 when Node.js came out, it was late 2009. I was magnetized to it. I thought this thing had the potential to be a pretty big deal. But of course, there were tons of skeptics, people saying, hey, JavaScript will never run on a server. It'll be too slow. No enterprises will adopt it. All these kind of these attacks against it as to why it wouldn't succeed. And the number one thing that I kept, kind of looking back at was, where are developers migrating today? Where's the developer kind of activity today? And developers were flocking to Node.js like crazy in 2009, 2010, 2011. And if you go back and look at kind of I think Indeed.com has like a jobs trend graph. The Node.js relative to basically every other programming language or framework was just orders of magnitude bigger. And when I launched NodeSource with my co-founder Dan Shaw, one of the things that we did is we would work with companies like PayPal and Netflix and Symantec even, and I remember talking to Symantec and they were saying like, look, we're having difficulty hiring just developers in general. I'm like, put Node.js as a technology that you support and watch what happens. And almost overnight, they were just flooded with applicants because people wanted to use this technology. And so, the rest is history. Node is, super popular, but the kind of exact same set of events, but I would say probably even accelerated and bigger, is happening with Solana. And so I have like a very simple thesis that I've been doing for probably the past 15 or 16 years with respect to emerging technologies, and that's to follow the developers. If developers are gravitating towards a particular programming language, a particular programming model, see what they're doing and determine whether or not it makes sense to invest in the space. Invest meaning time, resources, energy, et cetera. And I'll give you one last example of this. There was a fundamental shift in a programming model that kicked off in 2006 when Amazon launched AWS. And I can remember then too, people saying, I'm never going to lease my servers to a bookstore company, right? Like I'm always going to have my own data centers. And the programming model had fundamentally changed where you're getting access to compute on demand and storage and networking on demand. And that change in programming model has then thus set the stage for, massive hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of value in terms of the cloud today. And I think that one of the other things that is interesting about Solana, as you see developers gravitating towards it, there's also a shift in this programming model of, for better or worse, using the term smart contract programming. It's just a different way of writing software and having to think through, transactions and, the inputs are tokens, the outputs are transaction IDs, et cetera. That's another kind of tailwind that's pushing Solana. Is that on the one hand, developers love it because it's fun to build stuff on, it's fast, it's cheap. And on the other hand, there's this additional sort of lift with the change in programming model. So a lot of developers that are new to programming in general, they're learning how to build Web3 dApps by default. They're not even kind of exposed to the prior programming models for the past number of decades of building software.
Yep, that makes sense. I guess there are several ecosystems now with like developers, some in like Ethereum and Solana, some newer L1 chains. Like there's a lot of developers coming into the space. How do you figure out like what is tangible and what's realistic versus like what are just promises being made, and how do you kind of have a framework for that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, look, the Ethereum community has some of the smartest computer scientists on the planet working on it. Full stop. It is an incredible platform, and the things that people have built on Ethereum and are continuing to build on Ethereum is truly groundbreaking from a computer science standpoint. There's like this nuance though that I think is different when you look at say Ethereum and Solana. And I'm of the mind of there's space for multiple chains. I don't believe it's either or. I think it's all of the above, and all boats rise because of that. But I think there is something specifically different with respect to the types of applications that are, I guess, designed for Ethereum and not designed for something like Ethereum. And number one, there's a ton of developers and a ton of infrastructure and tooling and best practices that are in the Ethereum ecosystem today that have a lot to do with it being first, and have a lot to do with it being kind of groundbreaking in what they were able to do with the smart contract platform. However, as you start to think about Web 2.0 scale applications, it becomes challenging. And this is not, a debate as to whether or not Ethereum scales. That's not the debate. What I'm getting to is it gets challenging to developers to, when they have an option to pick something that is not proven to be massively scalable yet versus something that is pretty scalable, fast, and cheap. That's where I think the nuance shifts in towards something like Solana, is where the kind of redundancy focus of Ethereum's network has added an expense toward developers of saying, hey, there's going to be some non-determinism into your latency of the code, or maybe it doesn't even execute, right? That's hard as a developer to want to invest a lot of time, energy, and resource into a platform that doesn't necessarily today offer the same kind of opportunity, whereas with something like Solana, where it's basically saying, like, from the developer experience, you can get up and running really quickly. It's super cheap to build very effective and kind of hyper optimized apps. And by the way, we've got a really good plan for how to scale this. So I think that's where the framework that I use is not necessarily the computer science arguments. It's more along the lines of what is the experience for the end developer, and if the end developer has a better experience on a particular chain, then that's probably where I want to focus my time.
Got it. And you've played around with Solana a bit, I know, and I'm sure you've talked with a lot of people who have too. Like, how would you compare or explain to like a Web 2 developer of like how to get started, just so they can like wrap their head around a lot of the new concepts that you were talking about with like transaction IDs and outputs and inputs. Like, how would you kind of explain to a newbie developer getting started with Solana how to approach it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, to be honest, I don't have a great answer, because I think this is actually part of the opportunity for the Solana ecosystem today, is that, I think there's a really, well-known in Solana at this point, this guy Hoke on Twitter. I hope I'm saying his name correctly. I think he tweeted something along the lines of like, a veteran Solana developer has been writing a Solana app for 4 months, right? and there's some truth in that. But what it also says to me, as someone who's seen these types of open source ecosystems grow, is that there's a huge opportunity for what I call these migration paths to come over. And so today, like, I could probably Google some stuff and say, go read the Solana docs, or go read this tutorial on, what's the guy's name? Paul X, I think is his blog or something. So really, like, that would be the one I would start people with, and it's great, like, not taking anything away from it, but we need to build on that. And so part of that is, from my perspective, to get more developers onto Solana faster, you build migration paths to do that. So, for example, I was talking with a startup that hasn't launched yet that's going to be providing RPC infrastructure in Solana. And they're taking a kind of Web 2.0 cloud site reliability engineering DevOps approach to Web3 infra. And the reason I think that's so powerful is that you're taking people that are comfortable in a particular environment, managing cloud infrastructure, and then giving them a very similar looking user interface and set of commands that they can kind of understand the health of their applications, but with some crypto native stuff that's unique to Web3. Those types of things are where I see big opportunities for the Solana ecosystem to help bring more developers over. Is, hey, I'm a React developer, I want to build something on Web3, or I'm a Python developer, I want to build something on Solana, or I'm a C++ engineer. How do I build a Rust application? So there are ways of actually providing those that are more specific to maybe the developer's skill set. I haven't seen a lot of those types of tutorials or blog posts or videos, but those I've found to be extremely impactful long term, because again, it's not someone trying to like jump into a new programming model where inputs are tokens and outputs are transaction IDs, or a brand new programming language like Solidity on Ethereum. The barrier to entry is very high, right? And so what we want to do is try to provide an easier path, but understanding that like, hey, this is very, very different.
Yep. And I know there's a bunch of community-led projects like working on a lot of this kind of like bridge technology. What beyond just like, sort of like guides and tutorials and infrastructure that it makes it easier to build, like we're in the midst of the hackathon, like what are some just maybe user-facing applications you'd love to see built that are either gaps in the ecosystem or just big opportunities for people to tackle?
Oh man, it's a good question, because there are the obvious gap. I think I tweeted this a few weeks ago, is like a lot of it is like just not necessarily sexy work. It's like infrastructure related stuff. But if we get the infrastructure right, it unlocks the bigger opportunities. And so, from my perspective, I think there is still a tremendous amount of innovation that can be possible on Solana, as opposed to just kind of mirroring what has happened on, say, Ethereum and bringing it to Solana, which, by the way, is great, right? Like we need Saber. Like that's going to be super valuable longer term for the broader Solana ecosystem, right? But what is the new type of DeFi related innovation that could be only built on Solana? Like that's some stuff that I would love to see. But I think more generally, what are some Web 2 style applications that could only be built on a massively scalable chain like Solana? So like, and I'm not suggesting anybody go build this. This is just an example. If you try to build Reddit on Ethereum, I mean, I just don't think, currently, I don't think you could do it with just Ethereum. Maybe you add an L2 or something and, you get fancy with it. But something that's more like socially engaging, or something along like some I don't want to say social network, but something that's more along those lines would be super interesting, because I think one of the promises that hasn't necessarily been fulfilled by naysayers and skeptics of Web3 is we haven't seen this kind of like super easy to use, understandable community or social network style application. And I think that would be something that would kind of quell a lot of the concerns that a lot of folks have in the Web 2.0 space. I also do think.
I'm curious on that point. Like, do you think that like just bringing over, conceptually popular Web 2 products, whether it's, Reddit or another social network or Airbnb, and just like decentralizing it, is that going to be successful, you think, long term, or is it something else? I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Great question. So was literally talking with a startup last week about this. They were basically trying to do Airbnb, the idea of Airbnb, but on a decentralized platform or decentralized chain like Solana. And I said, ask yourself this question: does the end user care that it's built on Solana? No. You know what they want? They want to rent an apartment in Lisbon in November. Like that's the only thing they care about, right? And so I think part of the challenge with this notion of like, let's just grab some Web 2 applications and bring them to Web 3 is that in order for the users to come from Web 2 to Web 3, there's a pretty standard heuristic in user experience research and design that unless there is a 10x improvement in the experience, or a 10x, or a 90% decrease in cost or something, people just don't switch. It's one of the reasons why BlackBerry held on for so long until there was this 10x improvement with the iPhone, which caused a massive shift, right? So I don't want folks to not say that there isn't an opportunity with like bringing the Airbnbs over. I just think that there's more interesting problems to solve that are more Web3 or crypto native, whereas you're kind of bucking up against strong incumbency, right? Airbnb has been around for 12 years, 13 years or something. and that experience is very, very tailored and well designed, versus are you going to have a better experience and it's going to be on chain, right? I mean, I think that's the rub. So in short, I don't think just say bridging a Reddit or an Airbnb or whatever over is necessarily kind of the thing to do or the big opportunity. But my point is that what we haven't been able to see on something like Ethereum is something of the scale and magnitude of social interaction like Reddit. So what I would suggest to people to do is say, hey, don't go build Reddit. Rethink what it's like to have a karma system like Reddit has, or how do you incentivize engagement in a way that's meaningful on something like Solana? Because you can't really do that on the other chains, and it's cheap enough and fast enough to do it on Solana.
Yep. The other interesting thing I know people talk about that when it comes to like porting Web 2 kind of ideas over to Web 3 is like this notion that, you know, when you're centralized, right, you can coordinate on things like UX really easily and move really, really fast. As soon as you try to like decentralize, right, it becomes harder and harder as like a organization or, you know, to make those decisions, unlike, you know, a massive corporation like Reddit or Facebook or something. And so I guess do you have any thoughts on just like how maybe DAOs and like decentralized organizations will be able to kind of like compete on that level for, you know, meeting user needs? I'm curious to get your thoughts.
That's a fantastic question. Another one I don't have a great answer to, but I do have some thoughts.
Okay, go. So, no, love it.
So, you know, look, I think DAOs are probably one of the most underestimated phenomenons to kind of hit the world over the past few years. I really do, and they're really starting to pick up steam now over the past 18 months or so. What I like about the concept of DAOs and how it can actually, like, I think what you're describing is like designed by committee versus designed by Steve Jobs, right? Like there's one person saying it versus committee. And designed by committee, if I've worked at Frog Design for years, many years ago, it just doesn't really work. You can kind of get a decent product out the door, but like it just really doesn't work. Now, I think the difference is, and this is what's so unique about DAOs, is that if you're a member of a DAO, typically you're holding a token in that DAO, or in the case of like Monkey DAO, you're holding a Solana Monkey Business NFT. Everyone in the DAO is incentivized to either have the value of their NFT go up or the value of the token, like in Mango's case or Parrot's case, right? So you actually want to drive towards consensus because you're economically incentivized to do that. Whereas if you go to, say, a design agency in the kind of centralized world, you've got internal politics, you've got bureaucracy, you've got somebody woke up on the wrong side of the bed that day, right? Yes, everybody gets a salary and a bonus and et cetera, in theory, right? But that's not really the incentive for making the design by committee thing work. And so what I hope to see, and we've seen some of this with some of these DAOs. I mean, I'm pretty active in the Monkey DAO because it's been unbelievable to watch this thing unfold, because there's a skills channel in there, #skills in the Discord. And it is, I mean, you basically, you couldn't hire the spectrum of people that list their skills in this group. And so what I think is unique about that, or interesting longer term, is that the folks that are going to be most actively contributing are going to end up having some sort of like, social reputation or some reputation within the DAO to help drive a lot of decision making longer term. And people will tend to, corral around those folks. And it has to do with actually being active and contributing, as opposed to having like, a degree from RISD because you're a really good designer, right? Or you worked your way up the management chain and people have to listen to you. That's what I think is really interesting about DAOs and how they can try to solve for this. I haven't seen it yet, and I think this is what's so exciting about DAOs, is they're like this massively decentralized experiment, and we'll see what kind of spills out from that in the coming years.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I didn't know about the skills channel in the Monkey Discord. That's awesome. Maybe another question, last one on kind of like DAOs and like decentralization for you is like, I think one of the questions we get a lot from ecosystem projects is like, at what point do you kind of start decentralizing? So there's a lot of hackathon teams right now. They're just trying to find teammates, building an initial proof of concept. Is it when they need to get to mainnet? Do they need to like, create a DAO, get a treasury going, like, or should people wait? Maybe something similar to like a DYDX or a Uniswap model where they kind of waited till they had some level of adoption and then kind of like introduce a token and a DAO and all of that. So like, how do you think through that as a builder in the space?
Really, really great question. I mean, the short answer is I don't think there's, it's one or the other. I think it actually is a case by case scenario, and a lot of this will have to do with how, like, if you've ever started a company or worked at a startup at an early stage. I was talking with an infrastructure provider earlier today. It's a startup, and I was like, "So what are you guys raising money? You're gonna do a token?" They're like, "We've just been so heads down on product, we haven't even thought about it." Right? That's what it's about, and what really matters is like where you're putting your energy and time. And so one of the challenges can become, okay, we've got this really great idea for decentralized options markets or whatever, right? Cool, we're going to do that. But instead of building it, we're going to focus our energy on kind of the requirements for the DAO and the governance token and what all this stuff's going to look like, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the challenge could be that you couldn't even build the options market, right? Maybe it's just not possible, or it's too difficult, or you can't hire the right people, or somebody quits or whatever, right? And now you've spent all this time focusing on the DAO. I think it's worthwhile to have a conversation directionally early on with the team to determine, hey, should we consider having a DAO or not? Is this going to be a private thing or not? But ultimately, like you said, things like DYDX, over time, you can transition to it. And there was I think a centralized exchange recently flipped and became a DAO, and a Fox or something. I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, super famous guy in Bitcoin community, more or less converted this centralized exchange into a DAO and basically gave ownership to everybody that had ever transacted out of the exchange. So there's a ton of stuff that you can do longer term. You don't have to do it. I think part of the reason I would err on the side of like just go build as opposed to focus on like the political bureaucratic governance aspect from the beginning is that if you build something that is meaningful and there's an opportunity to provide a DAO around it in the future, you can always do that. If you're focusing on a DAO from the beginning, now you've got to manage the DAO. Now you've got to manage the community of the DAO and all the governance and all the proposals, and that can take time away from actually building the core product.
Yep. And kind of changing topics. I know, kind of a builder, a developer at heart, but it seems like you love trading, right? Like I see you all the time. You have a Telegram channel. You're on Twitter, talking about it. I'm assuming you also trade a ton in kind of like the centralized crypto world. Like, do you see a world where most of the kind of financial trading and lending and borrowing are happening in kind of like these DEX protocols, or is there always going to be kind of like this symbiotic relationship between the decentralized world and the centralized world when it comes to this from a trader's perspective?
Yeah, I love this question because I even kind of like internally flip back and forth on my position based on like new information, which I think ultimately drives to a good outcome. So on the one hand, I was chatting with over the past couple of years over COVID, my buddy Balaji Srinivasan and I were chatting about like, everything eventually going on chain in terms of data and in terms of contracts, and just basically anything that could become digitally enabled can go on chain. And this concept absolutely extends to basically every financial instrument out there. So will there be, kind of decentralized tokenized stocks and bonds and other types of securities? Absolutely. Will there be, kind of decentralized perpetual swaps? Absolutely. We already have those, right? Do I think that like the boomer traditional finance world is just going away? The philosopher in me says, don't take an absolutist position on anything, including this one. And so like, it's hard for me to just say, yeah, in the next 10 years, that constant bid of the S&P 500 from all these 401ks, from all these corporations, it's all going to be moving to DEXs. I think it's very difficult to probabilistically bet on that and say, yeah, that's absolutely going to happen, right? But on the other hand, I do think that the newer sort of generations that are getting into wealth creation and investment, especially folks that are probably teenagers now, are less likely going to be focused on, an index fund and more focused on, the virtual assets they have in the metaverse, and thinking of like how to manage that type of stuff. So on the one hand, I think there's going to be a significant amount of value that comes from tokenizing or fractionalizing or digitizing basically every financial contract today that can be swapped or traded. And then there's this net new set of instruments and like category of investments that will only be native to crypto and Web3 that will, potentially challenge longer term the kind of status quo of traditional investments. I think the one of the most interesting things that I've found, or I think Psi Options came out of either the last hackathon or the one before that. But there's a very fascinating concept that I think somebody had mentioned, maybe one of the Psi Options guys mentioned on Twitter or something, where you'll eventually be able to write options contracts against in-game assets or in-game levels that you go and beat or whatever. And so, like, trying to explain that to a traditional finance person, it just makes their head explode, right? So they're not going to understand how to write options contracts against like some skin in Star Atlas. It's just not going to make sense to them. But it probably does to a teenager who's playing video games. And so I think that there's the net newness of the types of investments opportunities that'll be out there will be significantly larger than what people actually think. And then furthermore, the continued digital enablement and sort of tokenization and bringing all of those instruments on chain is already happening, and it's going to continue to happen, because I can assure you that jump trading and all the people that they got involved with the Pith network, all those market makers, they're not just thinking of trading cryptocurrencies. They're going to be thinking of trading and making markets in basically every asset out there.
Yep. Yeah. I look forward to the day where I can, use my DJ Ape NFT as collateral for my mortgage. So
it's coming. It's all coming. Yeah.
I know. Cool. And so, yeah, like speaking of like NFTs, seems like you've kind of like dipped your toes into that world a little bit recently. Fad or the future?
Oh, definitely the future. So, look, there's I think there's something that isn't well understood about NFTs, especially when you talk to folks probably my age and older, is that for hundreds of years, traditional art markets continue to kind of pump each other's bags, if you will, by bidding up and buying really expensive paintings or sculptures or whatever. And I by no means am saying that a Van Gogh isn't worth whatever somebody pays for it, but that's the point. It's worth whatever somebody pays for it. And there's been this kind of generational and regenerational bid that keeps bidding up these assets, and it's subjective. Art is entirely subjective. What I find interesting about NFTs relative to, say, the traditional art market is that you now have a generation or two, call it Zoomers and millennials, that are somewhat not interested in a Rembrandt, right? They're more interested in a CryptoPunk as their profile pic. And it's an interesting way of being part of a tribe or a community. It's an interesting flex, right? Like all of these things that are kind of stemming from NFTs. But I think more importantly, there's something very unique and powerful about the programmability of the digital rights management and royalties and licenses, and basically having this kind of source of truth from the very beginning of its genesis. One of the biggest challenges in the art market is forgeries. There was a really amazing documentary about this guy who was, I think he was painting Pollux or something, but super famous artist. And it was like to the micro needle spot on, total forgery, right? You have really no way that these are ending up at Sotheby's and Christie's auction houses. And so you as a wealthy person, you're just assuming it's going to be an original. You have no proof of that. So there's, on the one hand, there's like the utility behind it when you digitally enable artwork like this and bake in rights management, licensing, royalties, et cetera. And then on the other hand, there's this sort of generational shift towards digital art as something that's interesting, meaningful, and ultimately subjective. Yes. Are there going to be people that constantly flip NFTs? Sure. Am I trying to build a floor sweeping bot? Probably. These things are absolutely going to be out there and happening. But I also think that one of the things that's so fascinating about this is it's raising a bigger conversation around what people value. And it turns out that if you looked at the past, I think up until like 2019 or so, some incredible stat. Buddy Travis at Ikigai put this out, where if you just bought the S&P 500 or like expensive whiskey, the whiskey like outperformed by like 10x. Or if you were always buying and selling Super Bowl tickets, they were significantly more valuable than investing in the S&P 500. And so my point here is that the NFT is like the implementation detail of how people nowadays value things. And what people value are not what has been kind of force-fed for many generations about what should be considered valuable and what is not. And that's what's really interesting about what's happening around the NFT space to me, is that it's still super early and there's still so much, kind of interesting, innovative stuff that can be done. But most importantly, it's showcasing how people today, mostly younger generations, value things.
Yeah, and I guess like as an NFT investor, like how do you understand what the value of these things are? Like with some of these DeFi protocols, like you can look at like, okay, well, how much trading volume is happening on this platform, and kind of like back into, if token holders took like 5 bips, it would kick back this percentage. And so it's sort of just a cash flow analysis. How do you think about it, like from an NFT standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the one hand, it's luck. So, I'm serious. Like in some cases, you may just be in the right, Discord group. You may be in the right Telegram chat. You may see something on Twitter or whatever, right? But beyond just luck, I do think that the types of NFT projects that are, and I'm talking about on Solana, that I have found to be the most valuable are the ones that have the most active communities. We talked about Monkey DAO and Solana Monkeys. That to me has value baked into it because there's an extremely active community behind Monkey DAO. And if you have an NFT project, irrespective of the chain that it's minted on, and there isn't this kind of like consistent community aspect behind it, it becomes difficult for me to see the value of that longer term. Now, what I will also say, I have tons of different NFTs. I have a majority of mine are SMBs, fortunately, but I have a ton of NFTs. And the reason is, on the one hand, some of these, it's almost like bootstrapping a new project. And if a project today may not have the best community behind it or doesn't have the most compelling roadmap, well, they just minted a bunch of NFTs. They have some money in their treasury. And in theory, if they take that money and invest it wisely in their project, maybe there's a big community outcome later on. So I actually think from an investment standpoint, I almost treat it kind of like a way out of the money call option on some of these NFTs. And then of course, the subjective aspect is, look, if I actually like it and it's, it goes for less than what I paid for it, fine. But I still think, by the way, there's a ton of really innovative work that can be done with NFTs. And if you look at what's the Ethereum project Loot, that to me is probably one of the most brilliant executions of internet culture ever, is to issue a bunch of NFTs with words or attributes on them, and then like the community has to get together and figure out a game or a story or whatever. That is like, I don't think it's ever been done in human history, at a global scale like this. And so things like that, those are kind of moments in time in internet culture that I think will retain their value longer term. Of course, again, we'll see what ends up happening with Loot and all the Loot copycats, but ultimately something like that is something that I would look for as an investor as well.
Yep. I guess like one of the big things you mentioned when talking about NFTs and DeFi is just kind of like the marriage between them of using NFT like assets in DeFi. Have you, I mean, are there any projects that you've seen that you're excited about in that particular space? Curious to know.
NFTs, like within to use it as like a means of like in a video game or a DAO or something?
Yeah. So like one that came to mind, I think it was in one of the previous hackathons, is DeFi Land. Is one. Is there any others? I'm curious to know if you've seen kind of others experiment in that space.
Yeah, so full disclosure, I am an investor and advisor to DeFi Land. I'm
Okay,
super
great.
bullish on it.
Okay, awesome.
It's a really awesome. I mean, it's killer team, amazing like everything about it is super cool. How do I say this without disclosing too much? So there's a company I spoke with today is looking at creating a game publishing platform that is, I'm already butchering it, but in short, they are looking at NFTs not as like a means of access or a means just for collateral, but there's there will be things like initial game offerings, like an IGO. And with that, you would have like the guns or whatever, like the genesis of these particular weapons, for example, or skins or whatever the thing may actually be. And so that has an NFT-like quality associated with it, but it's not, is it an NFT or is it like an in-game skin or some digital, like a digital good or whatever? Who knows what it is, but it's borrowing or at least drafting off of the concepts of NFTs, having this kind of genesis moment, and then royalties and license management, all that kind of stuff associated with it. There is, I think, there's two areas that I'm really interested with respect to the utility and applicability of NFTs. One is video games, which should hopefully be somewhat self-evident. And also there's a ton of stuff that can be done with that. But the other one, which I think is we're still like early days with this, is access. And so, for example, we would bring up MonkeyDAO again. Like, you can't get into MonkeyDAO unless you use Grapes protocol to verify that you have a wallet that holds an SMB. Full stop. What does that mean in the real world? Does that mean eventually there'll be SMB events that you can't even get into, are there certain deals that you may be able to get access to, or trades that people want to share? Like, what comes from access with respect to holding some of these NFTs? And so I think there could be some potential internet blowback from that type of elitism potentially. But I do think that there's something interesting about, like, hey, just go mint an NFT. Like, we have an infinite amount of these NFTs, just go mint them. And then it shows that like you're kind of like a card carrying member of this group. There's a project called Friends with Benefits, where you have to actually own or hold like a certain amount of the FWB token to even get access like into their website, right? So there's a paywall set up where if you can't verify that you're a holder of some of these tokens, you don't get access. So I think there's still a lot to be done around NFTs applicability with respect to access and what that means, whether it's DAO, whether it's in the real world, whether it's accessing content, it's accessing deal flow, whatever it may actually be. That's another really super interesting space.
Yep. Cool. So one of the other questions I had, I was curious to get your thoughts on as kind of like a trader in the space. I used to work in kind of like the Ethereum ecosystem, and I saw kind of like automated market making protocols become extremely popular, the likes of Uniswap and Curve and Balancer and such. But order books didn't really take off in the same way. Although order books in the traditional market, it's all order books. And so we've kind of seen a little bit of a shift in that in the Solana world, where we have something like Serum, which you mentioned before, and a lot of projects are plugging into Serum. But also we have things like Radium, Saber, these kind of like specific AMM pools that are getting really popular too. As kind of a DEX heavy user, how do you think about using these various platforms for trading? What do you think the kind of the future relationship between the two will be?
It's a great question. I think there's a world where they both coexist. So as a trader, I'll use a really clean UI on top of Serum. So DexLab is one that I've been using lately. I don't own any of the company or any of the token or anything. I just really like it. I think it's a great UI on top of Serum. Also Aldrin, which I think used to be like cryptocurrencies.ai or something. It's also a really good UI. Also, I think I actually own some of the token, but like I'm not an investor in the company or anything. Both of those are the kind of step function improvement in the user experience from a manual trader's perspective. So I can remember when, there was Ether Delta and 0x and like the first iteration of DEXs. And I was like, oh, finally decentralized exchanges. And I was like, oh my God, these are terrible to use. And no disrespect to like the 0x team, like, you guys are all doing like God's work because you invented basically DEXs, right? But it was just from a trader's perspective that's accustomed to a central limit order book and like direct market access and almost instantaneous transactions. I mean, it was just a lot left to be desired. And so today, if I'm going to be trading on a DEX, that's my preference, is to use something that mirrors or mimics that central limit order book style, because it's what I'm used to. And I can also kind of get a sense in terms of order book depth and how much will I actually punch into the book if I lift the offer or I sell into the bid or whatever, right? Whereas with AMMs, you don't really have that same level of fidelity or depth, if you will, into introspecting what the trade is actually going to look like. So what I do is, if I'm trading and I'm trying to, get in or out of a position at a particular price, I will go into, DexLab, for example, which uses Serum, and place my order and just let it sit, right? It's just sitting on the order books. And if it gets executed at some point, then great. If I'm actually just trying to quickly swap a token, I'll just go to Radium, I'll use Phantom. But I have found, and I learned this painfully the hard way, that if you swap on, say, something like Phantom, and by the way, love Phantom. I spoke to the CEO, they're amazing people, have nothing but respect for them and what they're doing. But when I swap it on Phantom, I was swapping a size that I probably shouldn't have been swapping. And well, let's just say I didn't get exactly back the dollar amount I was expecting in the swap. And so part of that is, user error on my part. It's also part of learning when, like what the limitations are and how you should be thinking about using something like a trading DEX, like DexLab, versus like, the swapping that comes with like Phantom or Radium.
Got it. Cool. Well, I think it's about time to wrap up. Coming close to the hour. Yeah, just want to give you maybe one more opportunity to give some advice to some of the people in the Solana hackathon. Yeah, whatever you feel like would be important to tell them.
Yeah, I mean, look, hackathons are meant to be fun. They are stressful because there's a deadline and whatnot. But I really do think like some of the most amazing stuff that's come out of the Solana ecosystems that is now on mainnet and in production started at a hackathon. So I would encourage folks to be as innovative and as expressive as you want to be, because if you land on something meaningful, you can see some of the other projects that have come out and have been successful in the path that they're on. The last bit is like, it sounds so like old man and cheesy of me, but just have fun. Hackathons are supposed to be fun. Don't, lose sleep, or if you do, make sure you're doing it intentionally or whatever, right? Like just have fun with it. The Solana ecosystem and the folks on the developer program are super accessible. The Discord is super active. So, if you there is no dumb question. This is all new. This is meant for a learning process, but make sure you have fun doing it.
Cool. I think that's great advice. Yeah, thanks, Joe. Thanks for jumping on. It was really insightful always chatting with you. So yeah, thanks so much.
You bet. My pleasure. See you guys.
Yep. Bye.